The most important moment in horror history started because a rich guy was bored. It's 1816. Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and Percy's 18-year-old girlfriend, Mary, are stuck inside a spooky Swiss villa during a massive storm. They've been reading ghost stories by candlelight for days, but Byron decides reading isn't enough. He wants a competition. He looks around the room and dares everyone to write their own tale of terror. The men immediately started bragging. They were the literary giants of their age. They assumed they'd write masterpieces. Mary, she said nothing. She just listened. But while the men were busy polishing their egos, Mary was tapping into something else. A real darkness, a grief so deep it terrified her. The men wrote forgettable scraps. Mary wrote Frankenstein. 200 years later, we're still using her nightmare to explain artificial intelligence. To warn about technology we can't control. To describe what happens when someone builds something powerful and then pretends it's not their problem. This is how an 18-year-old girl beat the boys at their own game. Before we get to the competition, you need to understand who was in that room, and why it was a powder keg waiting to explode. Lord Byron. Byron wasn't just famous, he was a disaster. The most talked about man in Europe for all the wrong reasons. He'd been chased out of England because of rumors about sleeping with his half-sister. Newspapers printed his scandals like tabloid headlines. Women fainted at his poetry readings. He was handsome, rich, addicted to laudanum, and completely out of control. He rented the Villa Diodati to escape his own reputation. It didn't work. Mary's stepsister, Claire Clermont, had followed him there. Why? Because she was pregnant with his child. Byron was pretending this wasn't happening. He'd sleep with Claire at night and ignore her during the day. The tension in that house was suffocating. Byron was also obsessed with death. He kept skulls in his room. He wrote poems about corpses. He once said he wanted to be buried with his dog. The man was a walking contradiction, charming and cruel, brilliant and self-destructive. Everyone in that villa was a little bit in love with him and a little bit afraid of him. Percy Bysshe Shelley. Percy was 23, wealthy, brilliant, insufferable. He wrote poems about atheism and revolution that most people couldn't finish. He believed he was a genius, rewriting the rules of literature, and he wasn't entirely wrong. His ideas were radical. His ego was bigger. He was also the kind of guy who abandoned his pregnant wife to run off with a 17-year-old. That 17-year-old was Mary. Percy had met her at her father's house. She was 16. He was married. Within weeks, they'd run away together, leaving his wife Harriet behind. Harriet would later drown herself in the Serpentine. Percy didn't attend the funeral, so when Percy sat in that villa, acting like the moral center of English poetry, there was a body count behind him that nobody talked about. Mary Godwin, 18 years old, no published work, no reputation. To the men in the room, she was Percy's girlfriend, someone to sit quietly and look impressed. Her mother was Mary Wollstonecraft, and one of the first feminists in history, author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Her father was William Godwin, a philosopher whose dinner guests were the most dangerous thinkers in England. Mary grew up surrounded by radical ideas, banned books, and conversations that could get you arrested. She'd also grown up with death. Her mother died 10 days after giving birth to her. Mary learned to read by tracing the letters on her mother's gravestone. She spent hours sitting by that grave, reading books in the shadow of a woman she never knew. And she carried another grief, one the men couldn't see. We'll get to that. John Polidori, Byron's personal doctor, 20 years old, insecure, desperate to be taken seriously by the cool kids. He spent the whole trip scribbling in his diary, hoping to sell it later. He had a crush on Mary that everyone noticed and nobody acknowledged. Nobody took him seriously. He'd end up writing the first vampire story in English literature, a story that would eventually inspire Dracula. But that night, just the tag-along. The guy who laughed too hard at Byron's jokes. The trap. One more player. The weather. 1816 was the year without a summer. A volcano in Indonesia, Mount Tambora, had erupted the year before, the largest eruption in recorded history. It choked the atmosphere with ash. The sun vanished. It rained for weeks. Snow Snow fell in June. Crops failed across Europe. People starved. The guests at Villa Diodati were prisoners. Storms crackled over the lake every night. The walls felt like they were closing in. Percy later described it as a wet, ungenial summer. British understatement for, we were trapped and losing our minds. So there they were, a toxic celebrity avoiding his pregnant ex. A poet with a dead wife he'd abandoned. The teenage girl he'd stolen, watching everything. A doctor nobody respected. All trapped by weather that felt like a curse. And then Byron, bored out of his mind, issued his challenge. Write a ghost story. Let's see who wins. Here's something most people don't realize. Mary Shelley didn't just write a scary book. She invented an entirely new kind of fear. Before 1816, horror meant Gothic fiction. Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, Matthew Lewis's The Monk. These writers built their nightmares out of the same ingredients. Haunted castles, ancient curses, ghosts rattling chains, mysterious monks, damsels fainting in corridors. The horror was always external. Something out there was coming to get you. A specter, a demon, a villain in a black cloak lurking behind a tapestry. And it was always supernatural, magic, curses, things that couldn't be explained by science. The fear came from the unknown, the ancient, the irrational. Byron and Shelley were steeped in this tradition. When they sat down to write, they reached for the same old toolkit. Byron started a fragment about a vampire, creepy, sure, but familiar. Polidori scribbled about a skull-headed lady. Percy tried something and gave up almost immediately. Too busy, too distracted, too convinced the real work was his poetry. They were playing the hits. Mary did something different. She moved the horror inside. In Frankenstein, there are no ghosts, no curses, no ancient evil. The monster isn't supernatural, he's scientific. Built from dead tissue and reanimated through electricity. Through galvanism, a real theory being debated in labs across Europe. Mary had listened to Percy and Byron discuss these experiments late into the night. Scientists like Luigi Galvani had made dead frogs twitch by running electrical current through them. Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, had speculated about creating life from inorganic matter. The newspapers were full of stories about doctors trying to reanimate corpses. The men talked about this stuff to sound smart at parties. Mary actually used it. She took the horror out of the castle and put it in the laboratory. She replaced magic with medicine. She made the monster a product of human ambition, not demonic forces. And then she did something even stranger. She made the scientist scarier than the monster. Two genres invented in one book. Science fiction, where the horror comes from technology and human overreach. Body horror, where the fear is our own flesh being manipulated, reshaped, reanimated against our will. The men were writing about vampires and skulls. Mary was writing about something that hadn't happened yet. But here's what the men at that table didn't know. Mary wasn't just writing a scary story. She was exorcising a demon. February 1815, a little over a year before the competition. Mary gave birth to a baby girl. She was 17 years old. The baby was premature, tiny, fragile. Born too early in a cold room with no doctor present. The baby didn't have a name yet. She lived for 11 days, then she died. Mary didn't talk about it, and not to Percy, not to anyone. But she wrote about it in her journal, a journal never meant to be read by anyone else. Dream that my little baby came to life again, that it had only been cold and that we rubbed it before the fire and it lived. A teenage girl, shattered by grief, dreaming that death wasn't permanent, that if she just warmed her baby's body by the fire, rubbed life back into those tiny limbs, loved it hard enough, it would breathe again. She had that dream over and over, for months. Now think about Frankenstein. A man creates life. He builds a creature from dead parts and sparks it into existence. The creature wakes up, confused, scared, desperate for love, for guidance, for someone to explain why it exists. And what does its creator do? He runs away. He abandons it. He looks at the thing he made and decides it's too ugly, Too wrong, too much. So he leaves. The creature isn't a monster. The creature is a baby that nobody wanted. Mary poured her grief into that book. The desperate wish to bring something back. The horror of creating life you can't control. The guilt of a parent who feels like they failed. The rage at a world that lets children die for no reason. The men at Villa Diodati were writing about vampires, skulls, things that would look good on a poster. Mary was writing about something that actually happened to her. No metaphor, no symbolism, just pain. Let's talk about the creature, because everything you think you know about him is wrong. The movie version, Boris Karloff, green skin, bolts in his neck, vocabulary of a toddler. That's Hollywood. That's not Mary's book. In the novel, the creature is brilliant, articulate. He teaches himself to read by hiding in a shed and listening to a family through a wall for months. He devours Paradise Lost, Plutarch's Lives, Goethe's Sorrows of young Werther. He becomes more educated than most humans. He tries to be good. He secretly chops wood for the family he's spying on. He saves a drowning girl. He wants, desperately, to be loved. And when he finally confronts Victor Frankenstein, he doesn't grunt. He delivers one of the most devastating monologues in literary history. I am malicious because I am miserable. Am I not shunned and hated by all mankind? I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. Make me happy, and I shall again be virtuous. I only became a monster because you made me one. I started out innocent. The world broke me. And then this. I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel, whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed. He's comparing himself to Satan, but he's saying he didn't fall because of pride or rebellion. He fell because his creator abandoned him, cast out for the crime of existing. Victor Frankenstein spent years building the creature, obsessed, driven, neglecting everyone who loved him. And the moment his creation opened its eyes, he took one look, decided it was ugly, and ran. Didn't teach it, didn't name it, didn't explain the world. Just left. Sound familiar? Picture a founder in Silicon Valley. Brilliant, obsessed. He builds something powerful, an algorithm, a platform, an AI. He doesn't fully understand how it works, doesn't think about what happens after, just wants to see if he can do it. And when his creation starts behaving unexpectedly, when something goes wrong, there's a meeting, then another meeting, then an apology written by legal, then a podcast appearance where he talks about learning from mistakes, move fast and break things. Victor Frankenstein's life motto, 200 years early. Mary saw it coming, before electricity was in homes, before anyone had heard of a computer. So, the ghost story competition. What happened to everyone else? Percy Shelley started something, got distracted, never finished. Too busy thinking about clouds and skylarks. Lord Byron wrote a fragment about a vampire. Got bored, abandoned it. Classic Byron, chase the shiny thing, lose interest, move on to the next scandal. Polidori took Byron's leftovers and turned them into the vampire, which eventually inspired Dracula, off partial credit. But none of them created anything close to what Mary did. And here's the thing nobody expected, including Mary. She didn't think she had a story. For days, she had nothing. The men were scribbling away, talking about their ideas at dinner, and Mary sat there in silence, convinced she'd already lost. She wrote later about the blank incapability of invention that tortured her. The shame of having nothing while everyone else seemed to have everything. The idea didn't come from confidence. It came from a nightmare she couldn't shake. A vision of a scientist kneeling over the thing he'd made, horrified by his own success. She woke up terrified, and she realized that was the story. When Frankenstein was published in 1818, Mary's name wasn't on it. The book was anonymous. Percy wrote the preface. Everyone assumed a man had written it, probably Percy himself. When they found out the author was an 18-year-old girl, critics were confused. Some refused to believe it. Surely someone so young, so female, couldn't have written something this dark, this complex, this dangerous. 200 years later, nobody cares about Byron's vampire fragment. But Frankenstein is a Halloween costume, a cereal mascot, a Netflix series, a verb we use every time someone builds something they can't control. The men at that villa wanted to win a competition. They wanted to show off. They wanted to prove they were the geniuses everyone said they were. Mary wanted something else. She wanted to take the worst thing that ever happened to her and make it mean something. The boys were playing a game. Mary was fighting for her life.